One rainy morning, an elderly woman, recently rejected from another job interview, noticed a leather wallet floating in a puddle near a glass skyscraper. Inside were enough cash to buy her grandson's heart medication for months, along with the identification of a powerful billionaire CEO who would never feel the loss. Yet she chose to return the wallet, unaware that she was about to be drawn into suspicion, humiliation, and a confrontation with power that would change both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Before we get back, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel because tomorrow I have something special for you. The rain fell in sheets across Philadelphia's downtown streets that Tuesday morning, turning the sidewalks into mirrors that reflected a gray sky and grayer prospects. Helen Moore pulled her threadbare raincoat tighter around her 70-year-old frame as she emerged from yet another rejection, the fourth that week. Her worn sneakers squelched against the pavement, water seeping through the cracked soles she'd tried to patch with duct tape. "We'll keep your application on file, Mrs. Moore," the manager at the coffee shop had said with practiced sympathy. What he meant, Helen knew, was that at 70 she was too old, too slow, too much of an insurance liability. Never mind that she'd worked as a custodian for 43 years before her forced retirement. Never mind that her hands, though wrinkled and marked by age spots, were still capable. Never mind that she needed work desperately. Helen walked slowly, her arthritic knees protesting each step. The bus fare back to her apartment in South Philadelphia would cost $2.50, money she'd budgeted carefully from the $842 she received monthly from Social Security. After rent of $650, after utilities averaging $80, after the bare minimum for food, there was almost nothing left, and certainly not enough for the medication her grandson needed. Tommy, 11 years old, with his mother's bright eyes and his late father's gentle smile. Born with a congenital heart defect that required medication twice daily, medication that cost $190 a month even with the assistance program. The prescription was due for refill in 3 days, and Helen had exactly $42 set aside for it. She'd called the pharmacy yesterday, hoping for an extension on the payment plan, but the answer had been firm: no payment, no medication. The rain intensified as Helen hurried past the gleaming towers of downtown Philadelphia, buildings so tall they seemed to pierce the low-hanging clouds. She didn't belong in this part of the city with its expensive shops and well-dressed professionals rushing past with designer umbrellas and leather briefcases. She was just passing through, taking a route she hoped might lead to one more potential employer, one more chance. That's when she saw it. The wallet lay half-submerged in a puddle near the entrance to one of those towering buildings, its rich brown leather darkened by rainwater but unmistakably expensive. Helen stopped, glancing around to see if anyone nearby had dropped it. The morning commuters flowed around her like water around a stone, each person absorbed in their own world, their own urgency. No one was searching the ground, no one looked back. Helen's first instinct was to walk past. Getting involved in other people's business had never served her well. But something made her bend down, her knees creaking in protest, and pick up the wallet. It was heavy, quality leather that probably cost more than she spent on groceries in 6 months. She turned it over in her weathered hands, water dripping from its edges. She should turn it in to the building's security desk. That would be the right thing to do. But Helen had learned through hard years that security guards in buildings like this didn't always treat people like her with kindness or trust. She'd experienced enough suspicious glances, enough assumptions about her character based on her worn clothing and lined face. The rain suddenly came down harder, and Helen made a split-second decision. She tucked the wallet inside her coat and hurried toward the bus stop 2 blocks away, seeking shelter under the narrow awning of a closed storefront. Her heart hammered in her chest, though she'd done nothing wrong. Yet, with trembling fingers, she opened the wallet. The first thing she saw made her breath catch. Cash. Thick stacks of $100 bills held together with a gold money clip. Helen's hands shook harder as she counted. 20 bills. $2,000. $2,000. The amount echoed in her mind, bouncing off the walls of all her desperate calculations. That was Tommy's medication for more than 10 months. That was 3 months of rent with money left over for food. That was security, breathing room, a chance to stop the constant anxiety that gnawed at her insides every waking moment. Helen's vision blurred, and she wasn't sure if it was tears or rain on her face. She looked at the license tucked behind the cash. The photo showed a stern-faced man in his early 40s with dark hair graying at the temples and penetrating blue eyes. The name read Alexander Reed. The address was for a penthouse in the very building she'd just walked past, the gleaming tower of glass and steel called Reed Innovations headquarters. Behind the license was a platinum credit card, the kind Helen had only seen in commercials. And behind that, more identification, business cards declaring Alexander Reed as Chief Executive Officer of Reed Innovations, a CEO. A man who lived in a penthouse, a man who probably made more in an hour than Helen had earned in years of scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins, a man who would never miss $2,000. The thought came unbidden, and Helen felt shame wash over her immediately. This wasn't her money. It didn't matter that she needed it desperately. It didn't matter that the man who lost it probably had millions. It didn't matter that finding this wallet felt like an answer to prayers she'd been too tired to voice anymore. She closed the wallet quickly, as if the bills inside might burn through her fingers. Her late husband, Robert, would have known what to do. He'd been gone 7 years now, taken by a heart attack while fixing a neighbor's leaky roof for free, because that's the kind of man he was. A good man, an honest man. The kind of man who'd raised her to understand that poverty didn't give you license to steal, that hard times didn't erase the line between right and wrong. But Robert had never had to watch a grandchild go without medication. He'd never had to choose between electricity and food. He'd never been 70 years old and unemployable. Helen stood under that narrow awning for a long time, the wallet pressed against her chest beneath her coat, the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the fabric above her head. People rushed past, umbrellas bobbing like a river of black mushrooms. None of them looked at her. To them she was invisible, just another elderly woman taking up space. Finally, Helen pulled out her ancient flip phone, the one Tommy had helped her learn to use. Her fingers, stiff with arthritis and cold, fumbled with the buttons as she searched for information about Alexander Reed. Even her outdated phone could access basic internet, though the tiny screen made reading difficult. What she found made her stomach clench. Alexander Reed, 42 years old, founder and CEO of Reed Innovations, a technology company specializing in medical devices. Estimated net worth, $3.7 billion. Philanthropist, widower, creator of the Reed Foundation for Rare Disease Research. $3.7 billion. Helen couldn't even comprehend such a number. She'd never had more than $3,000 in her bank account at any one time, and that was 30 years ago. But it was the last detail that caught her attention. Widower. And the Foundation for Rare Disease Research. This man had suffered loss. He'd known pain. The discovery made him human in a way the dollar signs couldn't. Helen looked at the wallet again, then at the building down the street. She could walk in there right now and return it. But the memory of her attempt to get work at a building just like this one, just 3 days ago, made her hesitate. 3 days earlier, Helen had sat at a computer terminal in the Free Library of Philadelphia, slowly typing her information into an online application for Reed Innovations. The posting had been for a night custodian position, and when Helen saw the requirements, 43 years of commercial cleaning experience, she'd felt a flutter of hope. The application process had been frustrating. The computer kept timing out, and Helen's unfamiliarity with online forms meant she had to start over twice. But finally, she'd submitted it, complete with references from 3 of her former supervisors who'd been kind enough to provide recommendations despite her age. To her surprise, she'd received a call the very next day. A woman from Human Resources named Jessica Marshall had asked her to come in for an interview that afternoon. Helen had dressed in her cleanest clothes, her gray hair neatly pinned back, and arrived 15 minutes early. The Reed Innovations building had been intimidating, all polished marble and modern art, but Helen had worked in buildings like this for decades. She knew how to clean them, how to move through them efficiently, how to make them shine. Age hadn't taken that knowledge away. The woman at the reception desk, young enough to be Helen's granddaughter, had looked up with a professional smile that faltered slightly when she took in Helen's appearance. "Can I help you?" "I have an interview with Jessica Marshall from Human Resources," Helen had said, straightening her shoulders. At 2 o'clock, the receptionist's eyes had flickered to her computer screen. "Your name, Helen Moore." A pause just a beat too long. "Of course, please have a seat over there. Someone will be down shortly." Helen had waited for 25 minutes on an uncomfortable modern chair that seemed designed more for aesthetics than actual sitting. Other people came and went, most of them young, dressed in sharp business attire, moving with the confidence of people who belonged. When Jessica Marshall finally appeared, she was a brisk woman in her 30s who barely made eye contact as she led Helen to a small conference room on the second floor. "Mrs. Moore," she'd said, settling into a chair across the table and opening a folder, "I've reviewed your application. Your experience is certainly extensive." 43 years, Helen confirmed. "I've worked in office buildings, hospitals, universities. I know how to maintain professional spaces to the highest standards." Jessica nodded, but her expression was already shifting into something Helen recognized, the prelude to rejection. "I have to be frank with you, Mrs. Moore. The night custodian position requires someone who can handle significant physical demands, lifting up to 50 pounds, working 8-hour shifts, sometimes climbing ladders for high windows or light fixtures." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Given your age, we have concerns about whether this would be appropriate, both for you and for the company." Helen had felt her face flush. "I'm in good health. I can provide a doctor's note confirming I'm physically capable. It's also a matter of liability and insurance," Jessica had continued, her tone becoming firmer. "Our workers' compensation rates are based on risk assessment. Employees over 65 represent a significantly higher risk category. The premiums alone would be..." She trailed off, as if the numbers spoke for themselves. "I understand risk assessment," Helen had said, hearing the desperation creep into her voice and hating it. "But I also understand that I can do this job. I've been doing it for over 40 years, I'm reliable, thorough, and I need this work." Jessica's expression had softened with something that looked like pity, which was somehow worse than rejection. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Moore, I truly am. But the decision isn't mine alone. Company policy is quite clear on this matter. We have to consider long-term viability and risk management." Helen had left the building with tears she refused to shed burning behind her eyes, the security guard watching her exit with an expression she couldn't quite read. The humiliation had burned worse than the rejection itself, the feeling that her decades of hard work, her reliability, her skill, all of it meant nothing in the face of a birth date on a form. She'd received the official rejection email that evening. "Thank you for your interest in Reed Innovations. While your qualifications are impressive, we have decided to pursue other candidates whose experience more closely aligns with our current needs." Translation: "You're too old, and we don't want the liability." Now standing in the rain with that same company's CEO's wallet in her possession, Helen felt the full weight of that memory. If she walked back into that building, would they even believe her? Would they think she'd stolen the wallet, was trying to scam her way into the building for some desperate revenge? The thought made her sick, but it also made her angry. Angry at a world that looked at her age and her worn clothing and saw someone to be dismissed, someone to be suspected, someone whose honesty would be questioned before it was acknowledged. Helen rode the bus home in silence, the wallet burning against her chest like a coal. The 40-minute ride took her through neighborhoods that grew progressively shabbier, from downtown's gleaming prosperity to South Philadelphia's struggling working-class streets. She got off at her stop and walked 3 more blocks to the narrow row house she rented, the second floor of its brick facade crumbling and its wooden steps creaking with age. Tommy was waiting inside, having let himself in after school with the key he wore on a string around his neck. At 11 years old, he was small for his age, his growth stunted by the heart condition that had been with him since birth. He looked up from his homework as Helen entered, his face brightening with a smile that never failed to crack open her heart. "Grandma, you're soaking wet." "Just a little rain, sweetheart." Helen hung her dripping coat on the hook by the door, making sure the wallet stayed hidden in the inside pocket. "How was school?" "Good, Mr. Patterson said my book report was the best in the class." Tommy's pride was evident, his chest puffing out slightly despite the slight wheeze in his breathing. "That's wonderful, honey. I'm so proud of you." Helen fought to keep her voice steady, to not let him see the desperation that clawed at her insides. She moved through the small apartment, its shabby furniture familiar and somehow comforting despite its wear. The place was clean, always clean, a lifetime of custodial work having instilled habits she couldn't break even in her own home. She went to the kitchen and started preparing dinner, pasta with butter and the last of the Parmesan cheese, supplemented with the frozen vegetables she'd bought on sale. As the water boiled, she watched Tommy through the doorway, his dark head bent over his schoolwork with serious concentration. He was such a good boy, so sweet-natured despite everything. He never complained about the medication that tasted bad, never whined about not having the newest toys or games his classmates talked about. He understood, in the way children sometimes do, that their life was harder than most, and he carried that knowledge with grace that sometimes made Helen want to weep. Tommy's father had died before he was born, killed in a construction accident. Helen's daughter, Marie, had struggled as a single mother for years before the car accident that took her life 2 years ago. Marie had been Helen's youngest, the only one of her 4 children who'd stayed in Philadelphia. The other 3 had scattered across the country, chasing better opportunities, building their own struggling families. They sent cards at Christmas, called on birthdays, but none of them had been in a position to take in an 11-year-old boy with expensive medical needs. So Helen had stepped in, as she'd always done. Because that's what mothers and grandmothers did. They carried the weight, no matter how heavy it became. After dinner, after Tommy had taken his evening dose of medication, after she'd helped him with the last of his homework, and tucked him into bed with a story from the library book they'd checked out, Helen finally allowed herself to face what she'd been avoiding all evening. She took the wallet from her coat pocket, and sat at the small kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light that made everything look stark and unforgiving. Her hands shook as she opened it again, confirming what she'd seen that morning. $2,000, still there, still tempting. Helen spread the bills on the table, smooth and crisp, more cash than she'd held in her hands in decades. She imagined walking to the pharmacy tomorrow, buying Tommy's medication without having to beg for an extension or a payment plan. She imagined paying the electric bill that was already 2 weeks overdue. She imagined buying Tommy new shoes, his current pair so worn the sole was separating from the leather. The temptation was enormous, a physical thing that seemed to have weight and presence in the small kitchen. But alongside the temptation came something else, something that had been building since the moment she'd opened the wallet, a simmering anger at the unfairness of it all. Why should she have to choose between honesty and her grandson's medication? Why did doing the right thing mean watching Tommy suffer? Why did billionaires exist while children went without necessary medicine? Helen's gaze moved to the doorway of Tommy's small bedroom, where she could see his sleeping form illuminated by the nightlight they kept burning. His breathing was slightly labored even in sleep, his damaged heart working harder than it should to keep his small body functioning. The medication helped, but it wasn't a cure. Nothing was a cure. The best they could hope for was management, keeping him stable until he was old enough for the surgery he'd need, surgery that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars they'd never have. Her fingers traced the edges of the bills, and she felt something hardening inside her. Not resolve to keep the money, but something else, a clarity she hadn't possessed before. This money wasn't hers. Taking it wouldn't make the world more fair, it would just make her someone who'd compromised the one thing she had left that nobody could take away: her integrity. But returning it wouldn't make her noble either, it would just make her honest, and honesty in a broken system was just another form of losing. Helen thought about Robert, about the values he'd instilled in her. Do right, Helen, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. But Robert was gone, and the world he'd believed in, where hard work and honesty were rewarded, had never really existed for people like them. Still, she gathered the bills and tucked them back into the wallet, not because she believed it would lead to anything good, not because she expected gratitude or reward, but because she wanted Tommy to grow up knowing that his grandmother was a woman who kept her integrity even when the world made that choice devastatingly expensive. Tomorrow she would find a way to return it. And then she'd figure out how to pay for Tommy's medication somehow. She always did, somehow. But tonight she let herself sit in the quiet kitchen and feel the full weight of what her honesty was going to cost her. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the rain having settled into a persistent mist that made everything damp without quite qualifying as precipitation. Helen woke early, her sleep having been fitful and broken by dreams where she was counting money that turned to ash in her hands. Tommy was still asleep, his small chest rising and falling with that slightly irregular rhythm that always made Helen's own heart clench with worry. She moved quietly through the apartment, making breakfast and preparing Tommy's morning medication. As he ate his oatmeal, she explained that she had an errand to run before continuing her job search, and that Mrs. Kowalski from downstairs would check on him until she returned. "Will you find a job today, Grandma?" Tommy asked, his voice hopeful. "Maybe, sweetheart. We'll see what the day brings." The bus ride downtown felt longer than usual, every minute weighted with anxiety about what awaited her at the Reed Innovations building. Helen clutched her purse, the wallet inside seeming to pulse like a living thing. She'd rehearsed what she would say a dozen times, but the words felt inadequate and small. The building looked even more intimidating in the gray morning light, its glass and steel facade reflecting the overcast sky like a mirror. Helen stood across the street for several minutes, gathering her courage. She was honest. She was returning something that didn't belong to her. There was no reason to be nervous, except there was. Because she'd learned that being honest and being believed were not always the same thing, especially when you were old and poor, and had just been rejected by this very company 3 days ago. But she couldn't keep the wallet. That path led to a place Helen refused to go. Finally Helen crossed the street and pushed through the revolving doors into the lobby. The same receptionists were at the desk, the blonde named Madison, and the brunette named Stephanie. Today it was Stephanie who looked up first. "Can I help you?" The tone was neutral, professional, but Helen caught the flicker of recognition in the woman's eyes. Helen approached the desk, very aware of her worn coat and outdated purse, the scuffed shoes that marked her as someone from a different world than the one represented by this gleaming lobby. "I found a wallet yesterday," Helen began, her voice steadier than she felt despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. "It belongs to Mr. Reed, Alexander Reed. I'd like to return it to him." Stephanie's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "You found Mr. Reed's wallet?" "Yes. It was on the sidewalk outside, in the rain, yesterday morning." Helen reached into her purse and pulled out the wallet, placing it on the desk's polished surface. "I wanted to make sure it got back to him safely." Madison, who'd been listening, leaned over to look. Something passed between the two receptionists, a glance Helen couldn't quite interpret, but that made her stomach tighten. "Where exactly did you find this?" Stephanie asked, her tone sharpening slightly as she picked up the wallet. "On the sidewalk outside, near the main entrance, yesterday morning, around 9 o'clock. And you're just returning it now?" Madison's voice held an edge that made Helen's jaw clench. "I had to get home to my grandson yesterday. I'm returning it first thing this morning." Helen kept her voice level, refusing to let them see how their suspicions stung. Stephanie opened the wallet, checking its contents with obvious thoroughness. Helen watched her count the bills, examine the credit cards, study the identification. The process felt less like verification, and more like an interrogation, and Helen felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I'll need your name and contact information," Stephanie said, pulling out a form. Helen Moore. She provided her phone number and address, watching Stephanie write it down with meticulous care. "And you said you found this on the street yesterday?" "Yes." Helen's patience was wearing thin. "I already told you that." Madison picked up her phone, speaking quietly into it, while never taking her eyes off Helen. The suspicion was palpable now, hanging in the air between them like smoke. Helen felt something shift inside her then, not just frustration, but a growing anger that she was too tired to suppress. She'd spent a sleepless night choosing to do the right thing, choosing honesty over her grandson's immediate needs, and now she was being treated like a criminal for it. "Is there a problem?" Helen asked, her voice taking on an edge that surprised even her. "Mrs. Moore," Stephanie said, her voice taking on that careful patronizing tone that Helen had heard too many times before. "I'm sure you understand that we need to verify your story. Mr. Reed's wallet contains a significant amount of cash and important documents. We need to review our security footage and confirm the details of your account." The implication was clear, though unspoken. "We need to make sure you didn't steal it. Everything that was in that wallet is still there," Helen said, her voice tight. "Every dollar, every card, everything. I found it and I'm returning it." "That should be the end of it." "We appreciate that," Madison interjected smoothly. "But you must understand our position. It's quite unusual for someone to keep a wallet overnight and return it the next day, especially one containing so much cash." Helen stared at them both, understanding dawning cold and clear. They thought she'd stolen it, or that she'd kept some of the money and was returning it only because she feared getting caught. They looked at her worn clothing, her lined face, her trembling hands, and they saw a thief rather than an honest woman. And suddenly Helen understood something else. They'd recognized her. Stephanie, at least, had recognized her from 3 days ago, when she'd walked out of this building after being rejected for a job. They thought this was some kind of scheme, some desperate play by a bitter old woman who'd been turned away. "I want to see Mr. Reed," Helen said, her voice hardening. "I want him to know from me directly that I found his wallet and returned everything in it." Stephanie's laugh was polite but dismissive. Mrs. Moore, Mr. Reed is an extraordinarily busy man. He doesn't meet with walk-ins, especially not over matters that can be handled through proper channels. Proper channels, Helen repeated, and she heard her own voice shaking with suppressed rage now. Is that what you call treating someone like a criminal when they're trying to do the right thing? No one is treating you like a criminal, Madison said, though her eyes said otherwise. We're simply following protocol. At that moment, a security guard approached, a large man in his 50s with a name tag that read Marcus. Stephanie gestured him over with a subtle motion that made Helen's pulse quicken. Marcus, could you please escort Mrs. Moore to the security office? We need to review some footage and verify her statement about Mr. Reed's wallet. Helen felt anger flare hot and bright in her chest. She'd anticipated suspicion, but this felt like something else. Like punishment for being old and poor, and presumptuous enough to walk into their gleaming building twice in 1 week. I'm not going anywhere, Helen said firmly. I returned the wallet. I've given you my information. I haven't done anything wrong. Mrs. Moore, Marcus said, his voice low and professional, if you cooperate, this will all be cleared up quickly. But if you refuse, we'll have to call the police and let them sort it out. The threat hung in the air, and Helen felt something crystallize inside her. Fine. If they wanted to treat her like this, she'd make sure they understood exactly what kind of person they were dealing with. Fine, she said, her voice like ice. Review your footage, call whoever you need to call. But I want a written receipt showing I returned this wallet, with all its contents intact, because I have a feeling your proper channels are going to try to claim otherwise. Stephanie's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her features. And while you're at it, Helen continued, you might want to ask yourselves why you're spending so much time suspecting someone who's trying to help, while the person who actually lost the wallet hasn't even noticed it's missing. The security office was a windowless room on the second floor, filled with monitors showing various angles of the building's interior and exterior. Marcus directed Helen to a hard plastic chair and informed her, with forced courtesy, that someone from Human Resources would be with her shortly. Helen sat in that chair watching the minutes tick by on the clock mounted on the wall. 10 minutes. 20. 30. Her anger had settled into something colder now, a quiet fury at the indignity of it all. Through the open door she could hear the security staff discussing her case, their voices carrying assumptions they apparently didn't care if she heard. Probably kept some of it and got scared. Returned it to cover her tracks. You see how old she is. Probably desperate. Each word was a needle prick, small but accumulating into real pain. Helen sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She would not let them reduce her to a desperate old woman who could be dismissed and demeaned. She thought about Tommy, wondering if Mrs. Kowalski had checked on him yet. She thought about the job applications she wasn't submitting while trapped in this room. She thought about Alexander Reed, the billionaire who wouldn't notice $2,000 missing, whose lost wallet had become a trap that had caught her in its jaws simply for being honest. Finally, after nearly an hour, a woman entered. Helen recognized her immediately. Jessica Marshall, the HR representative who'd rejected her application 3 days ago. For a moment, something flickered across Jessica's face, surprise perhaps, or discomfort at the coincidence. Mrs. Moore, Jessica said, her tone carefully neutral as she sat across from Helen with a tablet. I understand you found Mr. Reed's wallet and returned it this morning. Yes. Helen's voice was flat, giving nothing away. We've reviewed the security footage from yesterday morning. Jessica tapped on her tablet. We can confirm that you did pick up a wallet from the sidewalk outside our main entrance at approximately 9:13 a.m. I told them that, Helen said quietly, but apparently my word isn't good enough. Jessica had the grace to look uncomfortable. The concern, Mrs. Moore, is that the footage shows you examining the wallet's contents on the street, then concealing it inside your coat before leaving the area. You didn't immediately bring it inside or attempt to notify building security. Helen felt her face flush, but she kept her voice level. I was caught in heavy rain. I took shelter under a storefront awning to protect the wallet from getting more damaged. I looked at the identification to see who it belonged to. Then I went home because I had responsibilities there. I came back first thing this morning to return it, after keeping it overnight. A wallet containing $2,000 in cash. I didn't spend any of it. I didn't take any of it. every cent is there. Helen met Jessica's gaze directly. But you don't believe that, do you? You've already decided what kind of person I am. Jessica set down her tablet. Mrs. Moore, you have to understand how this looks. You applied for a position here just 3 days ago and were not selected. The very next day you're found in possession of our CEO's wallet with a considerable amount of cash inside. The implication hit Helen like a physical blow. You think I stole his wallet because you wouldn't hire me. You think this is some kind of revenge or extortion attempt. I'm not saying that, Jessica replied, but her eyes said she was thinking exactly that. I'm explaining why we need to be thorough in our review of this situation. Helen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The movement was so sudden that Jessica flinched slightly. I returned a lost item, Helen said, and her voice shook now, not with fear but with barely controlled rage. I did the right thing, the decent thing, and you're treating me like a criminal because I'm old and poor and you've already decided what kind of person that makes me. Mrs. Moore, please sit down and let us finish. No, the word came out sharp and final. I won't sit here and be insulted for my honesty. I returned the wallet. Everything is there. I've given you my information. If you want to pursue this further, you can contact me at the number I provided. But I'm leaving now, and if you try to stop me, I'll make sure everyone knows how Reed Innovations treats honest people who try to help. Jessica stood as well, her expression hardening. Mrs. Moore, I wouldn't recommend leaving. It could be interpreted as what? An admission of guilt. Helen's laugh was bitter. I'm guilty of being stupid enough to think honesty mattered. That's the only crime I've committed. She moved toward the door. Marcus appeared in the doorway again, blocking her exit, and Helen felt her heart hammering in her chest. But she'd come too far to back down now. Am I being detained? Helen asked, looking Marcus directly in the eye. Are you accusing me of a crime? Because if not, you have no legal right to keep me here. A tense moment passed. Marcus glanced at Jessica, who gave a tight shake of her head. You're free to go, Marcus said, stepping aside. But this matter isn't closed, Mrs. Moore. Helen walked out of that building for the second time in 4 days, her shoulders squared despite the tremor in her hands. She'd done the right thing, and it had cost her dignity, time, and peace of mind. As she stood at the bus stop in the drizzling rain, Helen felt something inside her harden. She'd returned the wallet because it was the right thing to do, because she wanted Tommy to have a grandmother with integrity. But she was under no illusions now about what that integrity was worth to people like those in the Reed Innovations building. Absolutely nothing. 3 days passed in a blur of worry and mounting desperation. Helen had used the last of her emergency fund, $17 she'd been saving for true catastrophe, to buy a partial supply of Tommy's medication. The pharmacist, Mrs. Denners, had been sympathetic but firm. She could give Helen enough for 2 weeks instead of the full month. But that was all. Cash only from now on. Helen had submitted applications to 8 more establishments, 2 diners, a grocery store, a dry cleaner, a hotel, a church, looking for a part-time custodian, a community center, and a veterinary clinic. She'd received immediate rejections from 5, the other 3 hadn't responded at all. She was beginning to understand a terrible truth at 70. In a world that valued youth and productivity above all else, she had become disposable. Not unemployable exactly, but undesirable enough that every door closed before she could get her foot in it. On Friday afternoon, as Helen was heating up soup for lunch, carefully measuring out the portion to make the can last 2 meals, her ancient flip phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway, hoping against hope it might be about one of her job applications. Mrs. Moore, this is Patricia Winters. I'm the executive assistant to Alexander Reed at Reed Innovations. Helen's hand tightened on the phone, a mixture of dread and anger flooding through her. Yes, Mr. Reed would like to meet with you. Would you be available to come to his office this afternoon at 3 o'clock? Helen's first instinct was to refuse outright. The memory of her last visit to Reed Innovations, the suspicion and humiliation, was still fresh and raw. May I ask what this is about? Because if it's to accuse me of something else, I'd rather save us both the trouble. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was gentler, warmer than Helen had expected. Mrs. Moore, I understand you had a difficult experience when you returned Mr. Reed's wallet. I want to assure you that this meeting is not about accusations. Mr. Reed has reviewed the entire situation personally, and he specifically requested this meeting to speak with you directly. To thank you. Helen felt her skepticism warring with curiosity. Why would a billionaire CEO want to personally thank someone for returning his wallet? He could have sent a check, or nothing at all. I think Patricia said carefully, that's a question Mr. Reed would like to answer himself. But I promise you, Mrs. Moore, you won't be treated the way you were on Tuesday. You have my personal word on that. Helen closed her eyes, thinking about Tommy's medication running out in 11 days, thinking about the rent due in 2 weeks, thinking about the fact that she had nothing to lose, because she'd already lost everything that mattered except her integrity, and no one could take that away unless she gave it up herself. I'll be there at 3, she said finally. After hanging up, she looked down at her clothes, the same worn items she'd been rotating through for years. For a moment she considered trying to find something better to wear, then dismissed the thought. Alexander Reed would see her as she was, or not at all. She'd done nothing to be ashamed of. Tommy was at school, which meant Helen wouldn't need to arrange childcare. She took the bus downtown once more, arriving at the Reed Innovations building at 2:45. The familiar sight of it made her stomach churn with anxiety, but she squared her shoulders and walked through the revolving doors. This time, Stephanie looked up from the reception desk with an expression that was markedly different from before. Not exactly apologetic, but certainly more respectful. Mrs. Moore, Miss Winters is expecting you. Please take the elevator to the 60th floor. Someone will meet you there. No suspicion, no hesitation, no security guard hovering nearby, just professional courtesy. Helen nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and made her way to the elevator bank. The ride up felt endless, the glass-walled elevator offering a view of Philadelphia spreading out below as she ascended through the building's 60 floors. Helen had never been this high up before. From up here, the city looked different, smaller, more manageable. She wondered if that's how billionaires saw the world all the time, from a height that made everything below seem insignificant. When the elevator doors opened, a woman was waiting. She was in her mid-50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in an elegant twist, wearing a charcoal suit that spoke of professional competence. Her face was kind, with laugh lines around her eyes and a warm smile that seemed genuine. Mrs. Moore, I'm Patricia Winters, thank you for coming. She extended her hand, and Helen shook it, noting the firm, respectful grip. I want to apologize for how you were treated when you returned Mr. Reed's wallet. What happened was unacceptable, and Mr. Reed was very displeased when he learned of it. Helen studied her carefully, looking for signs of insincerity or manipulation, but found none. I returned his wallet, she said simply. I didn't expect to be treated like a criminal for it. You shouldn't have been. Patricia's expression was somber. The staff involved have been counseled. It won't happen again. She gestured for Helen to follow her through a set of imposing double doors. Mr. Reed has been eager to speak with you since Wednesday afternoon, when he reviewed the security footage and incident reports himself. They entered an office so large it could have held Helen's entire apartment 3 times over. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across polished wood floors that gleamed like dark water. Modern art hung on the walls, pieces Helen suspected cost more than she'd earned in several lifetimes. At the far end, behind a desk that looked carved from a single piece of rich walnut, sat Alexander Reed. He stood as Helen entered, and she was struck by how different he looked from his license photo. The photo had captured the stern features, the gray-touched hair, the intense blue eyes. But in person there was something else, a weariness that pulled at his features, lines of grief etched around his mouth and eyes that made him look older than his 42 years. Mrs. Moore. His voice was deep and measured, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard the first time he spoke. Thank you for coming. Please sit down. He gestured to a seating area near the windows, 2 leather chairs and a low table, rather than the imposing desk. Helen appreciated the gesture, though she remained wary as she settled into one of the chairs. Reed took the other, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. I owe you an apology, Reed began, and my gratitude, though I suspect the apology is more urgent. Helen met his gaze directly. Your employees thought I stole your wallet. They treated me like a thief for returning your property. I know. Reed's expression was grave. I've reviewed the security footage, the incident reports, every detail of what happened Tuesday morning. Their behavior was unacceptable. I've addressed it. Have you?" Helen heard the skepticism in her own voice but didn't try to hide it. "Or did you just tell them to be more careful about making accusations they can't prove?" A hint of surprise flickered across Reed's features, followed by what might have been respect. "You're right to be angry. Their assumptions were based on prejudice, on looking at your age and your circumstances, and deciding they knew what kind of person you are. The same prejudice that kept me from getting the custodian job I applied for," Helen said quietly, watching his reaction. Reed was silent for a long moment. "I didn't know about your application until Wednesday when I had my team look into your background after learning about the wallet. Jessica Marshall is no longer with the company." Helen felt a jolt of surprise. "You fired someone because of me." "I fired someone because she represented a culture I don't want in my company," Reed corrected, "one that judges people by their appearance and their age rather than their character and capabilities. One that sees risk assessments as more important than human dignity." He leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes intense. "Mrs. Moore, may I ask you something?" Helen nodded warily. "Why did you return the wallet?" The question caught her off guard. "Because it wasn't mine to keep. There was $2,000 in cash. You clearly need money. Your application stated you're supporting a grandson with medical needs. That cash could have solved a lot of problems for you." Helen felt her jaw tighten. "Just because I need money doesn't mean I'm a thief, Mr. Reed. I'm not suggesting you are. I'm asking why you chose honesty over need." Helen looked at him for a long moment, trying to understand what he was really asking. Finally, she said, "I have a grandson who watches everything I do, who learns from my choices. I wanted him to know that his grandmother was a woman of integrity, even when integrity was expensive." She paused. "But I'll be honest with you, Mr. Reed, I'm not sure it was worth it. I spent a sleepless night choosing to return your wallet, and the reward for my honesty was being treated like a criminal by your staff." Reed flinched slightly at that. "You're right, and I'm sorry, truly." He stood and walked to the windows, hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the city. Helen waited, unsure where this conversation was going. 3 years ago, Reed said, his voice quieter now, "My wife Sarah died from a rare autoimmune disease. She was 40 years old. Brilliant, compassionate, the kind of person who made everyone around her better just by being in the room." Helen felt her anger soften slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss." Reed acknowledged this with a small nod. "I started the Reed Foundation in her honor, to fund research into rare diseases, and to help patients who can't afford treatment. It became my mission, my purpose after she was gone." He turned to face her. 8 months ago, I discovered that my CFO and my fiancée, Sarah's former doctor, had been embezzling from the foundation. Almost $2 million, stolen from funds meant to help people like your grandson. They'd been having an affair, using foundation money to finance it. Helen drew in a sharp breath. "That's terrible. It destroyed something in me," Reed said simply. "Not just the personal betrayal, though that was significant, but the realization that people I'd trusted completely, people I'd worked alongside for years, had been stealing from sick patients, from children. It made me question everything I thought I knew about human nature." He moved back to his chair, sitting down heavily. "For the past several months, I've been conducting an experiment. Every few days I have Patricia plant my wallet on the sidewalk outside this building, always in view of our security cameras. $2,000 in cash, full identification, everything someone would need to return it." Helen felt her stomach drop. "You've been testing people." "Yes. Before you, 17 different people found that wallet over the course of a month. 16 took the money and disappeared. One returned the empty wallet, claiming to have found it that way." Reed's gaze held hers. "You were the first person to return it with every dollar intact." Helen didn't know whether to feel vindicated or manipulated. "So my honesty was just part of your experiment. I was being evaluated without even knowing it." "Yes," Reed said simply, "and I understand if that makes you angry. After what happened to me, after being betrayed by people I loved and trusted, I needed to know if integrity still existed. If there were still people who did the right thing simply because it was right, regardless of personal cost." Helen stood abruptly, unable to sit still with the emotions churning through her. You don't get to test people like that, Mr. Reed. You don't get to use your money and your power to set traps for desperate people and then judge them for failing. You're right, Reed said, and the ready agreement surprised her. I was wrong. I let my cynicism and my pain turn me into someone who sees people as either honest or dishonest, trustworthy or corrupt, without understanding that life is more complicated than that. Life is very complicated when you're poor, Helen said, her voice shaking slightly. Do you want to know what I thought about when I was sitting at my kitchen table with your wallet? I thought about my grandson's medication. I thought about whether keeping that money would make me a bad person or just a desperate grandmother trying to keep a child alive. I thought about the fact that you would never even miss $2,000 while I was trying to figure out how to afford one more week of medicine. She took a breath, steadying herself. I chose to return it. Not because I'm better than the people who kept it. Not because I'm more moral, but because I wanted to be able to look Tommy in the eye and tell him that honesty matters, that who we are matters more than what we have. That was my choice, and you had no right to engineer it. Reed was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. You're absolutely right, I'm sorry. The apology seemed genuine, and Helen felt some of her anger dissipate, replaced by exhaustion. But I want you to know, Reed continued, that watching that security footage changed something in me. Not just the fact that you returned the wallet, but what happened afterward. When you came back the next morning to return it properly, when you stood in that lobby and endured suspicion and accusation with such dignity, when you refused to be diminished by people who should have been thanking you. He paused. You reminded me of Sarah. She had that same strength, that same unwillingness to compromise her principles. Helen didn't know what to say to that. I want to offer you something, Reed said, standing and moving to his desk. He picked up a folder and returned to where Helen stood. The custodian position you applied for. I want you to have it, if you still want it. Helen took the folder warily, opening it to find what appeared to be an employment contract. $18 per hour to start, Reed said. Full benefits including health insurance that would cover your grandson's medication and medical care. Flexible scheduling to accommodate Tommy's needs. And before you ask, this isn't charity, and it's not payment for returning my wallet. It's a job offer based on your 43 years of experience and your demonstrated character. Helen stared at the papers, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Your HR department rejected me because of my age, because of insurance liability. I've had a conversation with our insurance carrier, Reed replied. With proper documentation of your health status and some reasonable accommodations to the role, there's no legal or financial reason you can't work here. The objection was based on ageist assumptions, not actual policy. Helen looked up at him, searching his face for signs of pity or manipulation. Why are you really doing this? Reed met her gaze steadily. Because I need people in this company who understand what integrity costs. People who won't steal from the foundation because they remember what it's like to need help. People who see the faces behind the statistics. He paused. And because I was wrong about you, and I want to make it right. Helen thought about Tommy, about the medication running out in 11 days, about the rent due in 2 weeks. She thought about her pride, and whether pride was a luxury she could afford. But she also thought about walking into this building every day, working for people who treated her with such suspicion. Could she do that? Could she swallow that humiliation for a paycheck? What about Tommy's medical care? She asked. You mentioned the foundation has a program. Reed nodded. We do. It's called the Sarah Reed Medical Assistance Program. It covers medication costs, doctor visits, medical devices, and if Tommy needs surgery in the future, it can help with that too. Patricia can give you the application, though I'll be honest, I've already approved it. Helen felt tears prick at her eyes. It was too much, too perfect, too convenient. What's the catch? She asked, her voice rough. The catch, Reed said gently, is that you'll have to work for a company that initially rejected you and then suspected you of theft when you tried to help. You'll have to trust me when trust is probably the last thing you feel right now. And you'll have to let me try to be better than the person I've been for the past 8 months. Helen looked down at the employment contract again, at the salary that would change everything, at the benefits that could save Tommy's life. Can I think about it? she asked. Of course, take the weekend. Patricia will give you her direct number before you leave. Reed extended his hand, and regardless of your decision, Mrs. Moore, thank you for returning my wallet, yes, but more importantly for reminding me that integrity still exists, even when the world makes it devastatingly expensive to maintain. Helen shook his hand, feeling the firm grip, seeing something in his eyes that looked like genuine respect. As she left the office, Patricia was waiting with a warm smile and a business card. Mr. Reed's direct line is on the back, she said quietly. Call any time, day or night, if you have questions or concerns. Helen took the card, studying the older woman's face. May I ask you something? Of course. How long have you worked for him? 15 years, since he founded the company. Is he a good man? Patricia considered the question carefully. He's a brilliant man, who's been through terrible loss and betrayal. Sometimes that's made him cynical, sometimes it's made him make questionable choices, like testing people with wallets full of cash. She smiled slightly. But yes, Mrs. Moore, at his core, he's a good man, who genuinely wants to help people. He just forgot that for a while. I think you've helped him remember. Helen rode the bus home in a daze, the employment contract, and Patricia's business card tucked carefully into her purse. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the city as the bus wound its way through downtown toward South Philadelphia. She thought about Alexander Reed, about the grief etched into his features, about the way his voice had softened when he spoke of his late wife. She thought about the test he'd conducted, the manipulation of it, but also the pain that had driven him to it. She thought about his apology, which had seemed genuine, and his offer, which seemed almost too good to be true. But mostly she thought about Tommy. When she got home, Tommy was at the kitchen table doing homework, Mrs. Kowalski sitting nearby with her knitting. The elderly Polish woman looked up with a smile. Everything okay, Helen? Yes, thank you, Mrs. Kowalski. I appreciate you watching him. After the neighbor left, Helen sat across from Tommy, watching him puzzle through a math problem with his tongue stuck out in concentration. He looked so small, so vulnerable. The slight blue tinge to his lips that had been there since birth seemed more pronounced in the late afternoon light. How was your day, sweetheart? She asked. Tommy looked up with a grin. Good. We learned about the solar system in science. Did you know that Jupiter has 79 moons? I did not know that. That's amazing. Mrs. Patterson said we might get to visit the planetarium next month if we raise enough money. His face fell slightly, but the permission slip cost $20. $20. A field trip that would cost more than Helen spent on groceries for a week. But she smiled and said, we'll figure it out, honey. After dinner, after medication, after the evening routine that had become so familiar, Helen tucked Tommy into bed. As she pulled the blanket up to his chin, he looked at her with those bright, trusting eyes. Grandma, did you find a job today? Helen hesitated, then said, maybe. I have to think about it. That's good, right? Yes, sweetheart. That's very good. I hope you get it. Then maybe you won't look so worried all the time. The observation pierced Helen's heart. She'd thought she'd been hiding it, the constant anxiety, the fear, but children saw more than adults gave them credit for. I love you, Tommy, so much. I love you too, Grandma. After he drifted off to sleep, Helen sat at the kitchen table with the employment contract spread in front of her. $18 per hour. If she worked full-time, that was over $37,000 a year, more than she'd ever made even at the height of her custodial career. With benefits, with health insurance that would cover Tommy's medication, she pulled out a calculator and started working through the numbers. After rent, utilities and food, they'd have actual savings. Tommy could go on that field trip. He could have new shoes when he needed them. They could turn on the heat in winter without agonizing over every degree on the thermostat. But more than that, the medical assistance program could cover Tommy's medication immediately, could help with the surgery he'd need someday, the surgery that currently seemed as far away as the moon. Helen thought about her pride, about walking into that building every day knowing how she'd been treated. She thought about the test Reed had conducted, the manipulation of it. She thought about whether she could trust a man who'd engineered such an elaborate deception, but she also thought about what Reed had said, you reminded me of Sarah, and she thought about Patricia's words. He's a good man who forgot for a while. I think you've helped him remember. Maybe that mattered. Maybe helping someone remember their own goodness was worth something. Helen picked up Patricia's business card and stared at the phone number written on the back in precise handwriting. It was 9:30 at night, too late to call, but Patricia had said any time, day or night. Before she could talk herself out of it, Helen dialed the number. Patricia answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Moore, how did you know it was me? I gave that number only to you." There was warmth in Patricia's voice. "Have you made a decision?" Helen took a deep breath. "I'll take the job, but I have conditions." "I'm listening." "I want it in writing that Tommy's medication will be covered through the medical assistance program starting immediately. I want confirmation that I won't be penalized or questioned if I need to leave work for his doctor appointments. And I want assurance that I'll be treated with the same respect as any other employee, regardless of my age." "Done, done and done," Patricia said without hesitation. "I'll have the updated contract ready for you to review and sign on Monday. Can you start on Tuesday?" Tuesday. 4 days away. Helen felt a wave of vertigo at how quickly her life was changing. "Yes," she heard herself say. "I can start Tuesday." "Excellent. Come in at 9 o'clock. I'll handle your onboarding personally, and we'll get Tommy's medical assistance paperwork started immediately." After they hung up, Helen sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time, trying to process what she'd just agreed to. She'd taken a job at the company that had rejected her, offered by a man who tested her honesty without her knowledge, working alongside people who treated her with suspicion. But she'd also secured medication for Tommy, health insurance, a steady income, security. She thought about the wallet, about the choice she'd made to return it, about how that single decision had somehow led to this moment. Maybe honesty did matter after all, or maybe she'd just gotten lucky. Helen suspected the truth was somewhere in between. 6 months later, Helen Moore stood in the lobby of Reed Innovations at 5:30 in the morning, her custodial cart beside her, preparing to start her shift. The early morning was her favorite time in the building, before the rush of employees arrived, when the gleaming floors and quiet hallways were hers alone to tend. She'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm over the past months. The work was exactly what she'd been doing for 43 years, and her body had remembered the motions despite the time away. Her supervisor, Miguel Santos, was a kind man in his 40s who treated his team with respect and had made it clear from day one that Helen's age and experience were assets, not liabilities. The other custodians on the night shift had welcomed her warmly. There was Rosa, a Guatemalan woman in her 50s who shared coffee and stories during their break. James, a quiet man in his 60s who'd worked in commercial cleaning his whole life. And young Marcus, not the security guard but a 23-year-old trying to save money for college, who reminded Helen of what her grandson might be like in a dozen years. Tommy's medication had been covered through the medical assistance program as promised, and the change in him had been remarkable. With consistent access to his full dosage, his color had improved, his energy had increased, and for the first time in years, Helen didn't wake up every morning terrified that this would be the day his damaged heart gave out. They'd moved to a slightly better apartment in the same neighborhood, nothing fancy but cleaner and safer, with heat that actually worked and windows that didn't let in drafts. Tommy had his own room for the first time in his life. Helen had bought him new clothes, new shoes, taken him to the planetarium for that field trip and seen his face light up with wonder. But the most significant change had been internal. Helen no longer carried that constant weight of desperation, the grinding anxiety of not knowing how she'd make it through another month. She had savings now, modest but growing. She had security. She had hope. She'd seen Alexander Reed only occasionally over the past 6 months, usually when he arrived early or stayed late, their paths crossing in the quiet building. He always nodded in greeting, sometimes stopped to ask how she was doing, how Tommy was managing. The conversations were brief but felt genuine, and Helen had begun to believe that his apology and his offer had been sincere. This particular morning, however, was different. As Helen was finishing the executive floor, she found Reed already in his office despite the early hour, his desk lamp creating a pool of light in the pre-dawn darkness. He looked up as she knocked softly on the open door. "Mrs. Moore, you're here early. I always start at 5:30, Mr. Reed. You're the one who's here early." A hint of a smile crossed his features. "Couldn't sleep, too much on my mind." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Do you have a moment?" Helen hesitated, then parked her cart and entered the office. It still intimidated her slightly, the size and elegance of it, but less than it had 6 months ago. "How is Tommy doing?" Reed asked. "Very well, thank you. The medication has made such a difference. He's thriving in school, growing, acting like a normal 11-year-old boy for the first time in his life." Reed nodded, looking genuinely pleased. "I'm glad to hear that. And how are you finding the work here?" "It's good work. Miguel is an excellent supervisor, and the team is solid. I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Reed. I'm glad." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Mrs. Moore, I wanted to ask you something. The Reed Foundation is hosting our annual gala next month. It's our major fundraising event of the year, with donors and beneficiaries coming together to support our medical assistance programs." Helen waited, unsure where this was going. "I'd like you to attend," Reed said. "Not as staff, but as a guest. I think it would be valuable for our donors to meet someone like you, someone who understands firsthand what the Foundation's work means to families." Helen felt her stomach tighten. "Mr. Reed, I appreciate the invitation, but I'm not comfortable with that kind of event. I wouldn't fit in with your donors. You'd fit in perfectly with half the people there, the beneficiaries, and as for the donors, I think some of them could use a reminder of why they're writing those checks." Reed leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to give a speech or be put on display, Mrs. Moore. I'm inviting you to a dinner where you'd be as much a guest of honor as anyone else there." Helen considered this. The idea of attending a fancy gala still made her uncomfortable, but something in Reed's tone suggested this mattered to him. "Can I bring Tommy?" she asked. Reed smiled. "I was hoping you would." The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Kimmel Center, overlooking the lights of Philadelphia. Helen had borrowed a dress from Rosa, a simple navy blue gown that fit well enough, and Tommy wore a suit from the thrift store that Helen had altered to fit his small frame. As they entered the ballroom, Tommy's eyes went wide with wonder. "Grandma, this is so fancy." "It is, isn't it?" Helen held his hand, feeling out of place despite the invitation. Patricia Winters appeared almost immediately, looking elegant in a silver gown. "Mrs. Moore, Tommy, I'm so glad you could make it. Come, let me introduce you to some people." What followed was a whirlwind of introductions. Helen met Dr. Catherine Foster, the director of the Reed Foundation's Medical Assistance Program, a warm woman in her 60s who immediately put her at ease. She met other families who'd been helped by the foundation, a young mother whose infant had received a life-saving liver transplant, a father whose teenage daughter was in remission from a rare cancer, a grandmother not unlike herself, whose grandson had been fitted with a revolutionary prosthetic device. Each story was different, but they all shared the same thread: lives saved, families kept whole, hope restored where it had been lost. As dinner was served and speeches were given, Helen found herself genuinely moved by what the foundation was doing. Reed spoke about his late wife Sarah, about the promise he'd made to honor her memory by helping others, and Helen could hear the emotion beneath his controlled delivery. Then he said something that made her breath catch. "This year we've expanded our medical assistance program significantly. We're now able to help over 500 families annually, 3 times more than last year. This expansion was made possible not just by your generous donations, but by a reminder of why this work matters." He paused, and Helen felt his gaze find her in the crowd. "6 months ago, a woman named Helen Moore found my wallet on a rainy street. Inside was $2,000 in cash. Mrs. Moore, who was struggling to afford medication for her grandson, who had just been rejected for a job at my company because of her age, returned that wallet with every dollar intact. She did this expecting nothing in return, simply because it was the right thing to do." Helen felt heat rising in her cheeks as people turned to look at her. "I'll be honest with you," Reed continued. "I'd been testing people with that wallet, trying to determine if honesty still existed in a world that had disappointed me deeply. Mrs. Moore was the only person who passed that test, but more importantly, she taught me something I'd forgotten, that integrity isn't about passing tests or meeting expectations. It's about who you are when no one is watching, when doing the right thing costs you everything and gains you nothing." He smiled slightly. "Mrs. Moore now works at Reed Innovations, and her grandson Tommy receives medical care through our foundation. But the truth is, she helped me first. She reminded me why I started this foundation, why Sarah would have wanted me to continue this work even after losing her. She reminded me that goodness still exists, even in the darkest times." The applause that followed was genuine and warm. Helen felt Tommy squeeze her hand, his face shining with pride. After the speeches, as guests mingled, several people approached Helen to share their own stories or to thank her for her honesty. One woman, a donor named Margaret Preston, took Helen's hands in hers. "My husband and I have been giving to the Reed Foundation for years," she said quietly. "But hearing your story reminded me why it matters. Not just statistics and research, but real people, real families. Thank you for that reminder." Later Reed found Helen on a quiet balcony where she'd stepped out for air. "I hope I didn't embarrass you too badly," he said. "You did," Helen replied with a small smile. "But I suppose I'll survive." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the city lights. "I have something for you," Reed said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "But I need you to understand what it is before you refuse it." Helen took the envelope warily, opening it to find a letter on Reed Foundation stationery. As she read, her eyes widened. Position Community Outreach Coordinator, Reed Foundation salary, $42,000 annually, status, part-time, flexible hours, start date, at your discretion Alexander. "I'm a custodian," Helen said, looking up at him. "I don't have the qualifications for something like this." "You have the most important qualification," Reed countered. "You understand what it's like to need help. You know how it feels to be dismissed because of your age or your circumstances. You can talk to the families we serve in a way that staff with master's degrees never could, because you've been exactly where they are." Helen looked back at the letter, her mind reeling. "The position was Dr. Foster's idea," Reed continued. "She thinks having someone like you on the team, someone who can bridge the gap between the foundation and the families we serve, would be invaluable. You'd help families navigate the application process, advocate for them, share your own experience to give them hope. 20 hours a week, flexible scheduling around Tommy's needs." "This is too much," Helen said quietly. "It's what the position pays. Patricia helped create the job description, and she agrees you'd be perfect for it." Helen thought about the families she'd met tonight, about how overwhelmed she'd felt navigating the medical assistance application herself, how having someone who understood would have made all the difference. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course," Reed smiled, "though I hope you'll say yes. You've already changed the foundation once, Helen. Imagine what you could do with an official title." 8 years later, Helen Moore sat in a small office on the 15th floor of Reed Innovations reviewing applications for the Reed Foundation's medical assistance program. Through her window she could see the Philadelphia skyline, familiar now after so many years working in this building. Her office was modest but comfortable, decorated with photos. Tommy at his high school graduation, beaming in his cap and gown. Tommy at 19, standing in front of the University of Pennsylvania's engineering school. Tommy just last month at 20, healthy and strong, his repaired heart functioning perfectly after the surgery the Reed Foundation had funded when he was 12. There was also a framed photo from that first gala 8 years ago. Helen standing with Alexander Reed and Dr. Foster, the three of them smiling at the camera. Helen barely recognized herself in that photo, the uncertainty in her expression, the unfamiliarity with her surroundings. So much had changed since then. Her role as community outreach coordinator had evolved over the years. She'd started part-time, helping families fill out applications, walking them through the process, sharing her own story to give them hope. But as the foundation grew, so had her responsibilities. She now trained other outreach coordinators, developed educational materials for families, and spoke regularly at foundation events. She discovered that she had a gift for connecting with people, for making them feel heard and understood. The years of invisibility, of being dismissed and overlooked, had taught her to see others who were invisible. She knew how to talk to the elderly person who felt like a burden, to the single parent drowning in medical bills, to the grandparent trying to hold a family together against impossible odds. The foundation now helped over 2,000 families annually, and Helen took quiet pride in knowing she'd played a role in that expansion. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. Alexander Reed stood in the doorway, looking older than he had 8 years ago, his dark hair now more silver than gray, but with a warmth in his expression that had been absent when they first met. "Helen, do you have a minute?" "Of course, come in." Reed settled into the chair across from her desk, a reversal of their positions from that first meeting in his office. "I wanted to give you advance notice," he said. "We're announcing a new initiative next week. The Sarah Reed Medical Assistance Endowment. It's a permanent fund of $50 million that will ensure the foundation can continue helping families in perpetuity, regardless of annual fundraising results." Helen felt her breath catch. $50 million, Reed nodded. "It's been in the works for a while, but I wanted it to be secure before we made it public. No family should ever have to choose between integrity and survival, between doing what's right and keeping their loved ones alive. This endowment is a step toward ensuring they don't have to." Helen felt tears prick at her eyes. She thought about the woman she'd been 8 years ago, standing in the rain with a wallet full of cash, making an impossible choice. She thought about all the families she'd helped since then, the lives that had been saved or improved because the Reed Foundation existed. "Sarah would be proud of you," Helen said softly. Reed's expression softened. "I like to think so, but Helen, I need you to know that this endowment wouldn't exist without you. That night you returned my wallet, you didn't just remind me about integrity. You reminded me why I started this foundation in the first place. Not to test people or to wield power, but to help families like yours, to make sure that people don't suffer because they can't afford treatment." He pulled something from his pocket and placed it on her desk. Helen recognized it immediately, his wallet, the same one she'd found all those years ago. "I've kept this all these years as a reminder," Reed said. "But I think it belongs with you now." Helen picked up the wallet, running her fingers over the worn leather. It was empty except for a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it to find a handwritten note in Reed's precise script. "Integrity is doing the right thing when no one is watching, when it costs you everything and gains you nothing. Helen Moore taught me this on a rainy Tuesday morning in Philadelphia, and I will never forget it." Helen looked up to find Reed watching her with an expression she'd come to recognize over the years, genuine affection and respect. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything, for seeing me when I was invisible, for giving me a chance when no one else would, for helping Tommy." "Thank you," Reed replied, "for reminding me who I wanted to be." After he left, Helen sat alone in her office, holding the wallet and thinking about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the woman in the rain, desperate and invisible, making a choice that had seemed pointless at the time. She thought about Tommy, now a healthy young man studying biomedical engineering at Penn, wanting to design the medical devices that had saved his life. He called her every Sunday, his voice full of excitement about his classes and his future. She thought about the hundreds of families she'd helped over the years, the thank you letters and photos she kept in a drawer, reminders of why the work mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Tommy. "Got an A on my midterm. The professor said my design for a portable cardiac monitor was the best in the class. Going to celebrate with friends tonight. Love you, Grandma." Helen smiled, texting back, "So proud of you, sweetheart. Have fun and be safe." She looked out the window at the city, at all the lives being lived in those buildings, all the struggles and triumphs happening in homes and hospitals and homeless shelters. Somewhere out there, someone was probably facing an impossible choice right now, weighing survival against integrity, need against principle. She couldn't save them all. The foundation couldn't fix a broken system that forced people to make such choices. But because of a 70-year-old woman who'd found a wallet in the rain and made the hard choice, they were trying. And sometimes, Helen had learned, trying was enough to change a life, or 2 lives, or 2,000. The rain had started falling outside, tapping against the office windows in a gentle rhythm. Helen watched it for a moment, remembering another rainy day 8 years ago, then turned back to her work. There were applications to review, families to help, lives to change. She opened the first file and began to read. Epilogue. The wallet. Alexander Reed stood in his office on a quiet Sunday evening, the city spread out below him in a carpet of lights. He'd come in to catch up on paperwork, though he'd been doing less of that lately, delegating more, trusting more. On his desk sat a framed photograph from last month's foundation gala. In it, Helen stood surrounded by a group of families the foundation had helped, her arm around Tommy, who at 20 was tall and healthy, and beaming with pride. Helen was smiling, really smiling in a way that made her whole face light up. Reed thought about the journey that had brought them here,
about the test he'd conducted that had backfired so spectacularly, teaching him far more than he'd intended to learn. He'd kept a copy of the note he'd written and placed in that wallet before giving it to Helen. It sat in his desk drawer, a reminder of the day an elderly woman in worn shoes had reminded him what it meant to be human. His phone buzzed with an email. It was the preliminary numbers for the Sarah Reed Medical Assistance Endowment announcement. The response had been overwhelming, with additional donors pledging another $12 million to match the foundation's commitment. Reed allowed himself a small smile. Sarah would have been pleased. More importantly, she would have been pleased with who he'd become in the years since her death, moving from grief and cynicism back toward the man she'd fallen in love with. A man who tried to help, a man who valued integrity, a man who understood that wealth was meaningless unless it was used to lift others up. He opened his email and typed a message to Helen. The endowment announcement exceeded all expectations. Additional $12 million in matching pledges. None of this would exist without you. Thank you for finding my wallet on a rainy Tuesday morning 8 years ago. Thank you for everything that came after. E. Alexander. The response came quickly. Thank you for being the kind of man who learned from his mistakes. Thank you for honoring Sarah's memory by helping so many families. And thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. That changed everything. Alex and Helen Reed read the message twice, feeling warmth spread through his chest. He'd started Reed Innovations to create medical technology. He'd started the Reed Foundation to honor his wife's memory. But it was Helen who'd reminded him why any of it mattered: to help real people with real struggles to live fuller, healthier, more dignified lives. The rain continued to fall on Philadelphia, washing the streets clean as it always did. And somewhere in the city, Helen Moore was probably reading to her grandson about engineering concepts, planning for his future, living the secure and dignified life she'd earned through a single choice made on a rainy morning. A choice to do right, even when it cost her everything. A choice that had changed 2 lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. Reed turned off the lights and headed home, carrying with him the knowledge that integrity mattered, that goodness still existed, and that sometimes the smallest acts of honesty could ripple out into something far larger than anyone expected. The rain fell, the city slept, and the work of helping others continued.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.